Welcome to Champion Stories. If this is your first time here, subscribe now and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And now, on to today's story. The humid Manila air hung heavy over the sprawling General Santos city as Manny Pacquiao finished his morning routine at his private gym. Sweat glistened on his weathered face, each drop telling the story of countless battles fought and won. At 45, the legendary boxer still maintained the discipline that had carried him from the streets of Kibawe to the pinnacle of world boxing. The rhythmic sound of his gloves hitting the heavy bag echoed through the empty facility, a meditation that connected him to his younger self. As Manny unwrapped his hands, methodically removing each layer of tape with the same precision he once used to dissect opponents, his assistant Bayani approached with hesitation. The expression on the young man's face suggested something unusual was about to disrupt the peaceful morning routine. Bayani had worked for the Pacquiao family for 3 years, and Manny had learned to read the subtle changes in his demeanor, like reading the movements of an opponent in the ring. The news that someone was waiting outside surprised Manny. It wasn't uncommon for people to seek him out. Fans, business associates, politicians, and charity representatives were constant fixtures in his daily life. However, something in Bayani's voice suggested this visitor was different. The name spoken made Manny's hands pause mid-motion as he processed information that transported him back nearly 2 decades. Renato Villanueva had been more than just another opponent during Manny's early professional years. Their rivalry had been forged in the gritty boxing gyms of Manila, where both young fighters scraped and clawed their way toward recognition. They had fought twice in their careers, once when both were hungry prospects, desperate for any purse that could feed their families, and again 3 years later when the stakes had grown considerably higher. Manny had won both encounters, but barely, and the respect between them had been genuine and mutual. The years had carried them in vastly different directions. While Manny's career soared to international stardom, Renato had struggled with injuries and personal demons that gradually pulled him away from the sport they both loved. Their paths had crossed occasionally at local boxing events, exchanging polite nods and brief conversations that never quite captured the intensity of their shared past. Renato had eventually opened a small training gym in one of Manila's working-class neighborhoods, dedicating himself to teaching young fighters the fundamentals that might someday lift them from poverty. Walking toward the entrance of his compound, Manny felt the familiar weight of responsibility that seemed to follow him everywhere. Success had brought him wealth, fame, and political influence, but it had also made him a beacon of hope for countless Filipinos who saw in him proof that dreams could transcend circumstances. Every request for help, every plea for assistance, carried the unspoken expectation that he could somehow solve problems that extended far beyond his control. The figure waiting by the gate bore little resemblance to the fierce competitor Manny remembered. Renato's once powerful frame had been diminished by time and hardship, his shoulders carrying a burden that seemed to press down on his entire being. His clothes were clean but worn, and his hands, those same hands that had once thrown devastating combinations, trembled slightly as he recognized Manny's approach. The desperation in his eyes was unmistakable, the kind of helplessness that transforms proud men into supplicants. Manny's own expression softened as he observed his former rival's condition. Whatever had brought Renato to his doorstep clearly involved something more serious than financial troubles or business opportunities. This was the look of a man facing a crisis that threatened to destroy everything he held dear, a look Manny had seen too often in his role as congressman and humanitarian. The weight of unspoken words hung in the air between them, two fighters who had once measured their worth through their ability to inflict and absorb punishment, now brought together by circumstances neither could have imagined during their younger years. The security gate opened with a metallic creak that seemed to echo the tension hanging between the two former fighters. Manny gestured for Renato to follow him toward a quiet area of his compound, away from the curious eyes of staff members and the constant buzz of activity that surrounded his daily life. The walk was silent, punctuated only by the distant sounds of traffic from the busy streets of General Santos City and the occasional call of tropical birds nesting in the lush trees that lined the property. Renato's steps were hesitant, as if each movement forward required tremendous effort. His calloused hands fidgeted constantly, sometimes reaching toward his pocket before pulling back, other times running through his graying hair in gestures that betrayed his inner turmoil. Manny noticed these details with the same observational skills that had once allowed him to read opponents' intentions before they fully formed in their minds. Something about his old rival's behavior suggested a man wrestling with pride and desperation in equal measure. They settled on a wooden bench beneath the shade of an ancient mango tree, its branches heavy with fruit that reminded both men of simpler times when such abundance seemed like an impossible dream. The morning heat was already building, but neither man seemed aware of the temperature. Manny waited patiently, understanding that whatever had brought Renato to his doorstep required courage that didn't come easily to someone who had once shared the ring with him as an equal. When Renato finally began to speak, his voice carried the weight of sleepless nights and endless worry. The story that emerged painted a picture of a family struggling against circumstances that seemed designed to crush hope. His son, Isagani, now 23 years old, had inherited his father's natural athleticism and love for boxing. The young man had shown tremendous promise in local competitions, earning recognition as one of the most talented prospects in the Manila amateur scene. However, promise alone couldn't shield Isagani from the harsh realities that plagued many young fighters in the Philippines. A knee injury sustained during training had required surgery that depleted the family's modest savings. The recovery had taken longer than expected, and during that difficult period, financial pressures had forced Isagani to take work in a construction company owned by a man with connections to underground gambling operations. Renato's voice began to crack as he described how his son had gradually become entangled in a world that preyed on young men's desperation and naivety. What had started as legitimate construction work had slowly evolved into something darker, with Isagani being pressed into participating in illegal underground fights that operated outside any regulatory oversight. These brutal competitions offered substantial prize money to desperate fighters willing to risk everything, but they came with dangers that extended far beyond physical injury. The situation had deteriorated when Isagani witnessed something he wasn't supposed to see during one of these underground events. Renato's hands trembled as he explained how his son had inadvertently become aware of money laundering operations connected to the illegal fights. The knowledge had made Isagani a liability to powerful people who viewed witnesses as problems to be eliminated rather than complications to be managed. Manny listened without interruption, his expression growing increasingly grave as the full scope of the crisis became clear. He recognized the pattern from stories he had heard during his years in politics. Young people trapped in cycles of poverty and crime, forced to make impossible choices between survival and safety. The irony wasn't lost on him that boxing, the sport that had lifted him from similar circumstances, had become the very thing threatening to destroy Renato's son. Tears began streaming down Renato's weathered cheeks as he described the threats his family had received. Anonymous phone calls in the middle of the night, strangers lingering near their modest home, and warnings delivered through intermediaries had created an atmosphere of constant fear. His wife Marilu could barely sleep, and their younger daughter Clarita had stopped attending school because the family feared for her safety. The desperation in Renato's eyes intensified as he looked directly at Manny, his former rival now representing his only hope for salvation. The proud fighter who had once stood across from him in the ring was now reduced to a broken father, willing to sacrifice his dignity for his son's life. The magnitude of Renato's plea settled over Manny like a familiar heavyweight opponent, pressing down with relentless force. Years of public service had taught him to compartmentalize emotions during crisis situations, but something about this particular request penetrated defenses he had carefully constructed throughout his political career. The trembling man beside him represented more than just a former boxing rival. He embodied every Filipino father who had watched poverty and desperation threaten to consume their children's futures. Manny's mind raced through the implications of what Renato was asking. The underground fighting circuit that had ensnared Isagani operated in shadows that even his political influence couldn't easily illuminate. These organizations thrived precisely because they existed beyond the reach of conventional law enforcement, protected by corruption and sustained by the endless supply of desperate young men willing to risk everything for a chance at quick money. The irony struck him with particular force. Boxing had been his salvation. The discipline and dedication required by the sport had provided structure and purpose during his own impoverished youth. Now, That same sport, twisted into something unrecognizable by greed and criminality, threatened to destroy another generation. The legitimate boxing gyms where he had learned his craft seemed like ancient temples compared to the barbaric spectacles Renato described. Renato continued his explanation, his voice growing hoarser with each revelation. The underground fights took place in different locations each week: abandoned warehouses in Quezon City, private compounds in the provinces, even cargo ships anchored in Manila Bay. The organizers, led by a man known only as Teodoro, maintained strict security and employed former military personnel to ensure absolute secrecy. Fighters who attempted to leave the circuit often faced severe consequences, and those who threatened to expose the operation simply disappeared. The financial structure of these illegal competitions created a web of dependency that trapped participants more effectively than any physical restraint. Fighters received advances against future winnings, money that families desperately needed for medical bills, educational expenses, or basic survival. Once indebted to the organization, escape became virtually impossible, as interest rates and additional fees accumulated faster than prize money could eliminate the obligations. Isagani's situation had become particularly precarious because of his natural talent. His victories in underground fights had earned substantial money for his handlers, making him a valuable asset they refused to release. However, his accidental discovery of money laundering operations had transformed him from prized fighter into dangerous liability. The same abilities that made him successful in the ring now made him a target for elimination. Manny observed the physical toll this crisis had taken on his former opponent. Renato's once powerful frame seemed to have shrunk inward, as if the weight of helplessness was literally compressing his presence. His clothing, though clean, showed signs of extended wear that suggested financial resources stretched beyond their limits. The proud fighter who had once challenged him for regional titles now sat hunched over, his hands clasped so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. The broader implications of the situation troubled Manny deeply. Isagani's case represented countless young Filipinos caught in similar traps throughout the archipelago. Urban poverty created vulnerability that criminal organizations exploited with calculated precision, offering false hope to families who had exhausted legitimate alternatives. The underground fighting circuit was merely one manifestation of a larger problem that required systemic solutions rather than individual interventions. Yet sitting beside Renato, watching tears stream down the face of a man who had once been his fierce competitor, Manny felt the immediate human need override broader policy considerations. This wasn't about statistics or social programs. This was about a father's desperate attempt to save his son from forces beyond his control. The bonds forged through shared combat experiences, even adversarial ones, created obligations that transcended normal social boundaries. The morning sun climbed higher, casting shifting shadows through the mango tree's leaves, as both men contemplated the complexity of the situation before them. Renato's breathing had become irregular, the emotional strain of revealing his family's crisis combining with the physical exhaustion of sleepless nights spent worrying about his son's fate. Memories flooded through Manny's consciousness as he absorbed the gravity of Renato's situation. The underground fighting world that threatened Isagani bore disturbing similarities to environments Manny himself had navigated during his earliest professional years. He remembered the desperation that drove young fighters to accept dangerous opportunities, the way poverty could make even the most questionable propositions seem like reasonable gambles when families faced eviction or medical emergencies. The compound around them felt almost surreal in contrast to the harsh realities Renato described. Manny's success had created this sanctuary of security and comfort, but it also served as a constant reminder of how different his life could have been with just a few altered circumstances. The distance between his current position and the world-threatening Isagani seemed vast, yet Manny knew how quickly fortunes could change in the Philippines. His political experience had exposed him to the intricate networks of corruption that enabled operations like the underground fighting circuit. These organizations thrived because they provided services to wealthy clients seeking entertainment that legitimate venues couldn't offer. High-stakes gambling, unregulated violence, and the thrill of watching desperate men fight for survival attracted powerful individuals who viewed such spectacles as exotic entertainment rather than human tragedy. Renato's description of the threats against his family triggered protective instincts that Manny recognized from his own father's experiences. Rosalio Pacquiao had faced similar pressures during Manny's youth, when loan sharks and local strongmen had used intimidation tactics to control families struggling with debt. The cycle of poverty and exploitation that had nearly consumed his own family now threatened to destroy Renato's creating a parallel that made the current crisis feel intensely personal. The complexity of extracting someone from an underground fighting organization extended far beyond simple financial solutions. These networks operated through relationships built on fear, dependency, and mutual assured destruction. Fighters who attempted to leave often discovered that their families faced retaliation designed to force their return. The psychological warfare employed by such organizations was often more effective than physical violence, creating prisons constructed from terror rather than bars. Manny's mind began working through potential approaches to Isagani's predicament. His political connections included law enforcement officials who might be willing to investigate the underground circuit. But such formal interventions carried risks that could escalate the danger to Renato's family. The criminal organizations that ran these operations had survived by maintaining sophisticated intelligence networks and contingency plans for various types of interference. Alternative strategies required careful consideration of timing and resources. Manny possessed financial capabilities that could potentially buy Isagani's freedom, but such transactions often created additional obligations rather than providing clean exits. The underground fighting world operated on principles that made simple monetary solutions inadequate for complex human entanglements. His own transformation from impoverished youth to international celebrity had taught him valuable lessons about leveraging influence and resources for maximum impact. However, those lessons had been learned through legitimate channels that operated according to rules and regulations. The shadow world threatening Isagani functioned according to different principles entirely, where traditional approaches could prove not only ineffective but actively dangerous. The weight of Renato's expectations pressed against Manny's sense of responsibility. His former rival clearly believed that wealth and political influence could solve problems that had defeated his own efforts. This faith, while touching, also carried the burden of potentially unrealistic hopes. Manny understood that failure to help could devastate not only Isagani, but also destroy whatever remained of Renato's spirit. The morning heat continued to build around them, but neither man seemed aware of the temperature. Renato sat in exhausted silence, having poured out his family's crisis to the only person he believed might possess the power to provide salvation. His weathered hands had stopped trembling, replaced by the stillness of someone who had surrendered control of his fate to forces beyond his influence. Manny felt the familiar tension that preceded his most important decisions, the same internal pressure that had guided him through career-defining moments in both boxing and politics. The silence stretched between them until Manny finally shifted forward, his decision crystallizing with the same clarity that had guided his most crucial moments in the ring. Looking at Renato's defeated posture, he recognized something that transcended their shared boxing history. This was fundamentally about protecting an innocent young man from forces that preyed on vulnerability and desperation. The wealth and influence he had accumulated throughout his career suddenly felt less like personal achievements and more like tools that demanded purposeful application. Manny's mind moved systematically through his network of contacts, identifying individuals whose expertise and discretion could prove valuable in addressing Isagani's dangerous situation. His years in politics had introduced him to former military personnel who now worked in private security, law enforcement officials who understood the intricate operations of criminal organizations, and business leaders whose legitimate enterprises occasionally intersected with shadowy underworld activities. The most promising connection emerged from his memory of Rafael Guerrero, a former Philippine National Police colonel who had transitioned into private investigation work after retiring from active duty. Rafael's reputation for handling sensitive cases with minimal publicity had made him valuable to various high-profile clients seeking discreet solutions to complex problems. More importantly, his background included extensive experience with organized crime networks that operated in the gray areas between legal and illegal enterprises. However, Approaching this situation required delicate balance between decisive action and careful planning. Manny understood that rushing into intervention without adequate preparation could escalate the danger to Isagani and his entire family. The underground fighting organizations that Renato described possessed sophistication and resources that demanded equally sophisticated countermeasures. His political experience had taught him the importance of understanding all stakeholders before implementing any strategy. The criminal network holding Isagani operated through relationships that extended beyond simple employer-employee dynamics. These organizations functioned like extended families bound by shared secrets, mutual dependencies, and elaborate codes of loyalty that made external interference particularly challenging. Manny also recognized the psychological dimensions of Isagani's predicament. Young men trapped in such environments often developed complex relationships with their captors, combinations of fear, gratitude, and Stockholm syndrome that could complicate rescue efforts. Even if physical extraction proved possible, the emotional and mental recovery process might require extensive support that extended far beyond the immediate crisis. The financial implications of intervention needed careful consideration as well. While Manny possessed substantial resources, the underground fighting circuit represented serious business to its operators. Any solution that threatened their profit margins or exposed their operations to unwanted scrutiny would likely trigger aggressive responses designed to protect their interests. Simple monetary compensation might prove inadequate if the organization viewed Isagani's knowledge as an existential threat to their continued operations. Renato remained motionless beside him, his emotional exhaustion evident in every aspect of his posture. The proud fighter who had once challenged Manny in the ring now appeared completely depleted, having invested his last reserves of hope in this desperate appeal for assistance. His faith in Manny's ability to solve problems that had overwhelmed his own efforts created additional pressure that demanded careful management. The weight of responsibility felt familiar, yet different from anything Manny had previously experienced. His boxing career had involved primarily personal risks and rewards, while his political activities had dealt with broader social issues affecting large populations. This situation occupied a unique middle ground where individual action could directly impact a specific family's survival while potentially influencing broader patterns of criminal exploitation. Morning shadows continued shifting around them as Manny processed the full scope of what Renato was requesting. The mango tree above provided comfortable shade, but both men seemed oblivious to their physical surroundings. This conversation had transported them into a realm where past rivalries and current circumstances converged into something that demanded immediate attention and careful planning. Manny's expression had gradually shifted from sympathetic concern to determined focus, the same transformation that had preceded his most successful championship performances. The challenge before him required different skills than boxing or politics, but the fundamental approach remained consistent. Assess the situation thoroughly, develop a comprehensive strategy, and execute with unwavering commitment. Manny rose from the bench with purposeful determination, his movement signaling a shift from contemplation to action that Renato recognized despite his emotional exhaustion. The legendary boxer's body language conveyed the same focused intensity that had characterized his preparation for the most significant fights of his career. However, this battle would require weapons far different from gloves and athletic conditioning. It would demand strategic thinking, careful coordination, and the kind of influence that could only be wielded by someone who had earned respect across multiple spheres of Filipino society. Walking toward his private office within the compound, Manny gestured for Renato to follow, while his mind continued processing the tactical challenges ahead. The secure communication systems installed throughout his facility would allow discreet contact with individuals whose assistance might prove crucial to Isagani's salvation. Years of high-level political involvement had taught him the importance of maintaining relationships with people who operated in various sectors of Philippine society, including some whose activities existed in the gray areas between legitimate business and more questionable enterprises. The first call would go to Rafael Guerrero, whose investigative expertise and law enforcement background made him uniquely qualified to assess the underground fighting organization holding Isagani. However, even this initial step required careful consideration of timing and approach. Raphael's involvement would need to appear coincidental rather than deliberate, protecting both his own reputation and Manny's political standing from potential backlash if the intervention became public knowledge. Manny's office reflected his journey from poverty to prominence through carefully chosen memorabilia that connected his current success to his humble origins. Championship belts shared wall space with photographs documenting his congressional service, while traditional Filipino art pieces provided cultural context that grounded his achievements in national identity. This environment served as a constant reminder of responsibilities that extended far beyond personal interests. The complexity of extracting someone from an underground fighting circuit required understanding the economic dynamics that sustained such operations. These organizations generated substantial revenue through multiple streams: gambling on fight outcomes, entertainment fees charged to wealthy spectators, and various ancillary services that catered to clients seeking experiences unavailable through legitimate venues. Disrupting any single element could trigger protective responses that escalated rather than resolved the underlying crisis. Renato settled into a chair facing Manny's desk, his presence serving as a constant reminder of the human stakes involved in whatever strategy emerged from this planning process. The former fighter's weathered features reflected years of struggle that had culminated in this desperate appeal for assistance. His faith in Manny's capabilities created both motivation and pressure that demanded careful management throughout the intervention process. The investigation phase would need to identify key personnel within the underground fighting organization, map their operational procedures, and locate potential vulnerabilities that could be exploited without triggering violent retaliation. This intelligence gathering would require patience and subtlety, qualities that sometimes conflicted with the urgency of Isagani's situation but remained essential for successful resolution. Manny's political experience had exposed him to similar rescue operations conducted by various government agencies, providing insight into effective approaches while highlighting common pitfalls that could transform rescue attempts into disasters. The most successful interventions typically involved extensive preparation, multiple contingency plans, and coordination between various specialists whose combined expertise addressed different aspects of complex situations. Financial resources would certainly play a role in whatever solution emerged, but money alone rarely resolved problems involving criminal organizations whose power derived from fear and control rather than simple economic motivation. The underground fighting circuit that had ensnared Isagani represented investment in human assets that generated ongoing revenue, making fighters valuable property rather than simple employees who could be easily replaced. The morning was advancing, and Manny knew that every hour of delay potentially increased the danger to Isagani and his family. However, hasty action could prove counterproductive if it alerted the criminal organization to external interference before adequate countermeasures were in place. The balance between urgency and caution would determine whether this intervention succeeded or failed catastrophically. The secure phone in Manny's office connected him to Rafael Guerrero within minutes. Their conversation, conducted in the careful language that both men had learned to employ when discussing sensitive matters. Rafael's immediate availability suggested that retirement from active police service had not diminished his commitment to addressing serious crimes that threatened innocent civilians. His response to Manny's carefully worded request confirmed both his willingness to assist and his understanding of the discretion required for such operations. Within 2 hours, Rafael had begun mobilizing a network of former colleagues whose combined expertise covered various aspects of criminal investigation and tactical intervention. These individuals operated in the space between official law enforcement and private security, their services available to clients who required results that traditional channels might not provide. Their loyalty to Rafael stemmed from shared experiences in situations where conventional procedures had proven inadequate for protecting civilian lives. Manny observed Renato throughout these initial preparations, noting how his former rival's anxiety seemed to fluctuate between hope and terror as the reality of intervention became concrete. The psychological burden of involving other people in his family's crisis clearly weighed heavily on the exhausted father, who understood that each additional person brought into the situation increased both the potential for salvation and the risk of catastrophic escalation. The preliminary intelligence gathering revealed disturbing details about the underground fighting organization that held Isagani. The network operated through multiple cells that maintained limited contact with each other, a structure designed to prevent comprehensive infiltration by law enforcement agencies. Each cell controlled different aspects of the operation: recruitment, training, event management, security, and financial transactions, creating redundancy that made the organization resistant to targeted disruption. Teodoro's leadership style combined business acumen with ruthless enforcement of organizational discipline. Former fighters who had attempted to leave the circuit provided cautionary examples of consequences that awaited anyone who violated the unwritten contracts that bound participants to continued service. These examples served dual purposes, deterring current fighters from attempting escape while demonstrating to potential recruits that commitment to the organization was permanent rather than temporary. The financial investigation uncovered revenue streams that extended far beyond simple fight purses and gambling proceeds. The underground circuit served as a recruitment pipeline for various criminal enterprises that valued individuals with combat training and demonstrated willingness to engage in violent activities. Successful fighters often graduated to higher-paying positions within drug trafficking networks, illegal arms dealing operations, and private security forces that protected criminal leadership from law enforcement interference. Raphael's contacts within the banking sector identified suspicious transaction patterns that suggested money laundering activities connected to the underground fighting circuit. These financial flows represented potential pressure points that could be exploited to disrupt the organization's operations, but they also indicated connections to larger criminal networks whose retaliation capabilities exceeded anything that Isagani's situation alone might trigger. The tactical assessment revealed that direct confrontation with the underground fighting organization would likely result in escalated violence that could endanger numerous innocent people beyond Isagani and his immediate family. The criminal network possessed sufficient resources and personnel to wage sustained conflict against anyone who threatened their operations, making conventional rescue approaches extremely dangerous for all involved parties. Alternative strategies focused on creating circumstances that would motivate the organization to release Isagani voluntarily rather than forcing his extraction through confrontational means. These approaches required patience and sophisticated manipulation of incentives that addressed the criminal network's business interests while providing face-saving alternatives to violent retaliation. Manny's political connections offered potential leverage through regulatory agencies that could create administrative difficulties for businesses connected to the underground fighting circuit. However, such approaches risked exposing his involvement in ways that could compromise both his political career and the safety of everyone involved in the rescue operation. The afternoon sun streamed through the office windows as both men contemplated the complexity of the challenge ahead. Renato's faith in Manny's capabilities remained unshaken, but the detailed planning process had revealed obstacles that extended far beyond what either fighter had anticipated during their emotional meeting beneath the mango tree. 3 weeks after that emotional morning beneath the mango tree, Isagani Villanueva stood in the same compound where his father had made his desperate plea to Manny Pacquiao. The young man's physical condition reflected the ordeal he had endured, but his eyes carried something that had been absent during his time with the underground fighting circuit, hope tempered with genuine gratitude rather than the desperate bravado that had sustained him through months of illegal competition. The solution that had emerged from Raphael's investigation proved more elegant than anyone had initially anticipated. Rather than direct confrontation with Teodoro's organization, the intervention had focused on creating alternative opportunities that served everyone's interests. A legitimate boxing promotion company, quietly backed by Manny's financial resources, had approached the underground circuit with an offer to recruit talented fighters for sanctioned professional competitions. Isagani's natural abilities, which had made him valuable to the criminal organization, became his pathway to freedom when the legitimate promotion offered contracts that exceeded anything the underground circuit could provide. The financial incentives were structured to benefit not only the fighters themselves, but also their previous handlers, creating win-win scenarios that eliminated motives for violent retaliation. The money laundering evidence that had made Isagani a liability transformed into leverage that encouraged cooperative transition rather than hostile resistance. Raphael's contacts within law enforcement had quietly indicated that continued scrutiny of financial irregularities might intensify unless certain organizational changes occurred voluntarily. This pressure, applied with surgical precision, motivated the criminal network to view legitimate partnerships as preferable alternatives to sustained legal investigation. Manny watched the reunion between Renato and his son with emotions that connected directly to his own relationship with his father and his children. The embrace between father and son contained years of worry, months of terror, and weeks of cautious hope, finally transformed into relief and genuine joy. Marilu and Clarita had accompanied Renato to witness Isagani's safe return, their presence completing a family circle that had been fractured by circumstances beyond their control. The legitimate boxing contract that secured Isagani's freedom also provided structure and purpose that addressed underlying issues that had made him vulnerable to criminal recruitment. Professional training facilities, medical support, financial planning assistance, and educational opportunities created comprehensive support systems designed to prevent future exploitation while developing his athletic potential through proper channels. Renato's transformation throughout this process had been as dramatic as his son's rescue. The broken man who had appeared at Manny's gate 3 weeks earlier had gradually recovered his dignity and purpose as hope replaced desperation. His gratitude toward Manny remained profound, but it was tempered by understanding that the solution had required cooperation from numerous individuals whose combined efforts made individual heroics unnecessary. The afternoon sun cast familiar shadows through the mango tree as the Villanueva family prepared to leave Manny's compound and return to their normal lives. However, normal had been redefined through this experience to include possibilities that had seemed impossible just weeks earlier. Isagani's legitimate boxing career offered potential for success that could lift his entire family from the poverty that had made them vulnerable to criminal exploitation. Manny reflected on how this intervention had reinforced lessons learned throughout his own journey from impoverished youth to international prominence. Individual success created opportunities to influence broader patterns of social injustice, but meaningful change required collaborative efforts that addressed systemic problems rather than merely treating symptoms. Isagani's rescue represented one victory in a larger struggle against forces that preyed on desperation and vulnerability. The bonds forged through this crisis had transformed former boxing rivals into allies united by shared commitment to protecting innocent people from circumstances that threatened to destroy their futures. Renato's tears had been replaced by determination to ensure that other families would not face similar ordeals alone, creating legacy that extended far beyond personal salvation into community protection and mutual support. Thank you for watching another episode of Champion Stories. If you enjoyed today's story, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of our upcoming inspiring tales about Manny Pacquiao. Share your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one, and many times your ideas inspire our next episode. See you next time.